I started my paranormal mystery webcomic, Tip the Ferryman, back in February of 2021. At the time of me recording this, its 5-year anniversary is coming up, and I frequently get the question of, how did you start your webcomic, and how did you stay dedicated to it for this long? And I wanted to take a minute to talk about that. So, hello everybody, welcome to this Sketch With Me video, digital this time. Feel free to break open your own sketchbook, break open your own drawing program, sit down and draw with me for a while I, ramble about my webcomic and my art and my philosophy on art and that sort of thing. For those who are new around here, my Sketch With Me videos are smaller, very unscripted videos that I put out in between larger projects in order to keep both you and the algorithm happy, because, we live in a digital hellscape. But if you're looking for a more structured video on advice on how to start your webcomic, I have a video called 5 Tips on How to Start Your Webcomic Now. It should be up on the screen or in the iCard or whatever is most accessible for whatever device it is you use. This is just going to be me kind of telling a little story here. So, my webcomic, Tip the Ferryman, came out in February of 2021. Its actual release date was 28th. But it had been in development for about a year, but the story of this comic starts in probably one of the stupidest places imaginable, so I need all of you to hear me out for like 5 seconds. Have any of you heard of the web series Half-Life VR, but the AI is self-aware? Those of you who have seen Nathan, who is here on screen, the thing I'm drawing right here is my 3 main characters from my webcomic, Nathan, Eddie, and Mai, and you can read the comic at tiptoferryman.com, by the way. So, I was really into Half-Life VR, AI, but the AI is self-aware. I'm gonna call it Holverai for short. It is this improv series done by Wayne Radio TV and a couple of his friends, where he basically plays Half-Life with, technically it's Gmod, but he plays Half-Life with VR mod installed, and all of his friends are playing, like, the different NPCs, pretending to be, AI, like, just pretending to be, like, the models and stuff like that in the game. And they all have goofy, funny names, like Tommy and Coomer and Bubby and Benry. And Wayne basically pretends to be Gordon Freeman, the protagonist of Half-Life, and shenanigans ensue. There is a weirdly kind of, like, very emotional arc about one of the characters realizing that he's in a video game, and it's very stupid for the most part. It is very much a comedy series, right? But there is genuinely, like, a lot of heart put into it, and you can tell that, like, everybody in the series is having a lot of fun, right? Apparently recording the final speech given by that self-aware character, apparently made the actress that plays him cry, and I think it says a lot. But so I was insanely into this series. It was 2020, we all know what was happening then, and I had just graduated high school, actually. Like, I was on the verge of graduating high school, because the school that I went to at the time, I was a senior, and whenever everything happened, those of us who were getting pretty decent grades got an email from our principal, and he was like, do you guys want to, like, just go ahead and graduate? And we were like, fuck yes, we do. Fuck yes, we do. Fuck this. Get us out of here. So I technically graduated high school without even finishing all my classes, but I was getting all A's and B's at the time, so whatever. So I had nothing to do. I was, not living in a very happy place, so I was on the internet all the time, and I was obsessed with Holverai, right? For those of you who know my history, you know what I'm about to bring up. And I ran this Ask blog on Tumblr called Gordon Radio TV, which was basically a series that explores the idea of Gordon himself also having been a character outside of, like, his player's influence, and, like, what happens in the aftermath of the player beating and thus leaving the game. And it's very fanfiction-y. I look back on it now, and I do giggle a little bit, because my art and my writing has heavily improved. But it made it had like a crazy impact on my life. It was an Ask blog, but there was also like a pre-planned story. So there was like comics, and there was gigantic arcs. There was even a soundtrack that was done by my now fiance Celine, who I actually met as a consequence of Gordon Radio TV. She started reading it, mutual friend, really liked it. A whole 9 yards, but this isn't a story about how I met my wife. That's a different story for later. But I was really into this, and it was my first time having like a pretty large audience for a story I was creating, and through Hulverai also, Hulverai is not the only like goofy Half-Life fan series that has been created over the years, and again, you guys know where I'm going with this. There is another one called Freeman's Mind. If you do decide to go watch it, I will warn you. It is like very much like a 2007 machinima series. There's some ableism and like some like homophobia and shit like that in there, but it is still like a very good and genuinely very, very funny series. I do enjoy it a lot, and I am not kidding whenever I tell you there has not been a single day in the past 5 years where I have not thought about Freeman's Mind. It's kind of a fucking problem. But the whole Variety fandom was doing a thing at the time where they all found out about all these different Gordons and thought it was very funny to create like a timeline AU thing called the Freemanverse, where the canon Half-Life Gordon, Hulverai Gordon, and Freeman's Mind Gordon all basically accidentally got stuck in a timeline together where they all ended up in Black Mesa together, and shenanigans ensue, right? And I get attached super easily to asshole characters that secretly care. So the thing about going into Freeman's Mind is that, like, I was a very pretentious, like, 18 going on 19-year-old kid using Tumblr, so I thought it'd be cool to basically just, like, completely rewrite Freemind's character to still, like, yes, be, like, an asshole and be very inconsiderate and all that kind of things, but basically, like, strip him of a lot of the stuff that really made him bite, as like a character or whatever. And after I finished up Gordon Radio TV, there was another AU, which no longer exists on the internet. I took it down for personal reasons, that I made. That was like a fantasy AU, and I was like obsessed with my rewrite of Freemind. That's what the fandom called him, Freemind's character, and I named him Nathan. Yes, I know. Okay, listen, hear me out. I have a defense for this later. I named him Nathan, and in this, like, fantasy AU, Hulverai Gordon and Freemind Gordon were twin brothers, and I had to name him Nathan because obviously both of them cannot be named Gordon. I cannot have a Gravity Falls situation on my hand here, so, because I wasn't going to call one of them Gord and the other Dawn or something like that. Like, that'd be stupid. Well, actually, it'd be kind of funny. Shout out to anybody that did that. And I, like, really fleshed out Freemind's character, quote-unquote Freemind. It was so removed from canon at this point. The only thing that was resembling this, like, creature that Ross Scott created was the fact that he's tangentially related to having come from Freeman's Mind. He's kind of an asshole. He shared at least a fandom-based last name, and he had an eye patch because there's an entire episode of Freeman's Mind where he speaks like a pirate, like with completely accurate dialect, by the way. Ross Scott, you're a fucking madman. Completely accurate pirate dialect, and so the fandom, whenever creating Freemanverse, was like, oh, so, like, you know, the way that we can tell Freemind apart is because at some point in Black Mesa, he loses an eye, so he has to have an eye patch, and that's, like, a funny reference to the way that the logo changes during the pirate episode, and fandom is crazy. I love fandom. I will likely never participate in it again, but, yeah, and there is a thing called filing off the serial numbers, which is basically whenever somebody writes a fan fiction and then takes the writing, but then just replaces all the characters and all the copyrighted names with their own original characters and then just, like, publishes that. I do think there is a difference between that and what I like to call he would not fucking say that ing too close to the sun, Which is what I really think I did with Freemind. My version of this character was not anything like what Ross Scott had created, beyond he's vaguely a bit of an asshole, right? And I think I got to a point within that fandom where I kind of realized that was the case, and I just kind of, like, picked up the design that I created for him and kept the name and just started developing an idea of him being a protagonist of his own outside of, like, the context of Half-Life or Freeman's Mind or anything like that. Because essentially what I had done was looked at a character, took a very surface level read of him and gone, yeah, I could probably rewrite that, and then just made, like, a whole other guy. So, in my defense, the thing I was going to defend later is I do think that is very different from just straight up, like, taking a world and taking characters and that kind of thing and just, like, nudging them a little bit to the left so that you can publish what you put on AO3 last week, right? Because there is very much a difference between just doing that and having, like, put so many headcanons and interpretations and different versions of, like, all these characters and things like that to a point where, like, you've basically just made an OC. Like, that fantasy AU did not have to be anything like Hulverai. Like, I'm gonna be honest, all of the characters I was using in that AU were so out of character, and I think it was just, like, me trying to get away from writing solely, like, fandom stuff and trying to dip into something a little more original, but wanting to keep that audience that I had because of Hulverai still around. So I just, like, slapped the Hulverai faces and, like, names onto characters that were not Hulverai characters, right? So that's kind of how my protagonist, Nathan, was born, right? From fucking Freeman's Mind. And again, like, if you followed me for a while, you know that that's my history, and I bet that's not that surprising to you, but it's probably one of the funniest fucking things to come out of my very intense Hulverai obsession and subsequent Freemind obsession, which still exists. If for some reason Ross Scott ever finds out about any of this, I am so fucking sorry, man. I don't know what else to tell you, dude. People have done worse, and you know what? Good for them. But my hands are clean of this situation. Don't make a guy that's so interesting next time, maybe. So, after I had kind of, like, separated away from Hulverai and gotten away from the fandom and that sort of thing, I had always kind of been really into the idea of making a webcomic. I tried to make one whenever I was, like, 13 years old. That one also no longer exists on the internet for a variety of reasons. That being, like, the primary one being that, like, I was 13 and trying to write about some very, very serious topics that I was not prepared to write about, and as a result, a lot of the stuff in that old webcomic was very, very bigoted, and unintentionally so, but, like, something can still have hateful elements without that hate being intended, and as much as I would have liked to have it archived as my history, I didn't like the idea of, like, a young kid coming across that, and thinking that, like, you know, it's an accurate depiction of the mental health topics that I was discussing at the time, and was not at all prepared to be discussing. I was trying too hard to be BoJack Horseman, basically. So that comic no longer exists online, but I've always been really, really, really interested in making comics, right? So there was my initial one that I made about 100 pages of before giving up, and now it no longer exists on the internet. And there's a couple of other ones that I took a couple of shots at, primarily fantasy ones. Like, one that I'm actually working on turning into a novel right now, Here's to the Starcatchers. There was another one called Other Folk, which I'm workshopping in the background. I can't decide what I want to do with it yet, but every single time I had tried to make, like, a comic out of them, I just couldn't stick to it, right? And Gordon Radio TV was the first time I'd really been able to stick to a gigantic project like that. There was another fandom project just before that through Epithet Erased, which you can probably tell if you've read my webcomic is a gigantic inspiration for it. But I'll get into that in a minute. So, I had never really been able to do, like, a big project like that until Gordon Radio TV and that Fantasy AU and that sort of thing. So it was a bit of a gigantic leap for me, and I started going through, like, a bunch of different ideas. I had Nathan. Freeman's Mind also has, like, a character, quote unquote. It's not much of a character. It's just some guy that Gordon mentions offhand named Eddie that he apparently buys illicit substances from. And so I had created, like, it was a thing in, like, the Freemanverse, like, fan base to create, like, your own interpretation of what the different characters in those different universes would look like. So a lot of people had basically just been able to take a name for an OC, Eddie, and just make an OC to hang out with Freemind, and I thought that was really funny. So yes, that's also how Eddie, the second protagonist of my comic, exists, but he has really nothing to do with Freeman's Mind Eddie either, other than the fact that they share a name. At least a first name anyway. Pierce was something that I made up. And obviously Eddie doesn't deal in illicit substances. Whether or not he uses them, well, I can't say that on YouTube. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But I'd never really been able to do, like, a gigantic project like that. And now that I knew that I could do it, I really wanted to start exploring the idea of me being able to do this. And Tip the Ferryman actually started out as a cyberpunk sci-fi mystery. It started off out as a cyberpunk sci-fi mystery, and it was called CMYK, which was a very generic name. And the idea was that Nathan was not the protagonist. He was like a side character, and so was Eddie. And the primary mystery was about Nathan's twin brother, whose name was actually Bernie at the time, which was a joke about how the twin brother dies in a fire, because I thought I was hilarious, and honestly, still pretty funny, I won't lie to you. It was like this, like, the death of Nathan's twin brother, Bernie, had been, like, the main mystery that was going to be solved by a young detective, very heavily inspired by Angus MacDonald from The Adventure Zone, by the name of Moss. That's not their actual name. Their real name is Mikoto, and they go by that, but they wanted, like, a detective name, so they called themselves Detective Moss, because I thought that was funny. And they were just basically trying to solve, like, this gigantic mystery in a futuristic cyberpunk location. But here's my thing. I actually, despite having been a really big fan of Half-Life and the fact that I love Portal, I actually don't really like sci-fi all that much. There's nothing wrong with the genre. It's just a matter of personal taste. It's just not something I personally engage with too much. So trying to create CMYK was like pulling teeth, and I feel like what I was doing was I felt like I had to stick with the sci-fi shit because I wanted to keep the audience that I had grown through, like, my divulgence into the Half-Life fandom, right? But it was making me miserable. So one day I said to myself, okay, what am I going to do with this? And I basically started from scratch. There were a couple of characters that were kept from CMYK. Joey actually started as a character in that comic too. Joey, if you don't know, is Nathan's young nephew who he's been taking care of since the death of his father. And Joey was a lot older in that initial comic. He was going to be like 17, I believe it was. And he was going to be Mikoto's co-detective, right? So things shifted around a little bit. Nathan was my favorite little guy. Like, he was the character I thought about the most. He was the character that I enjoyed the most. And I really just wanted him to be the protagonist. So I decided, first of all, make that happen. Second of all, what genres do I actually really enjoy, broadly speaking, right? And that is mystery. My biggest inspiration of all time will always be Gravity Falls. And I've always really wanted to make, like, a kind of paranormal mystery that is still somewhat grounded in reality, at least a little bit, in some sort of, like, small town, right? So I kind of shifted away from it being sci-fi and more towards it being, like, a mystery that is being, like, involved with ghosts somehow. And I was tossing around ideas and that sort of thing, and I was trying to think of, a couple of, like, recurring things in the comic, like motifs and that sort of thing. And it had a bit of a more, like, gritty aspect to it at the time. Eddie and Nathan had been friends for a very long time. Eddie was still a bit of, like, an underground dealer, this time in weapons instead of substances. And they still kind of, like, lived in this very, like, dystopic, like, not very safe place. And I was trying to think of a cool, like, exchange for the two of them to have, right? If you've ever read, like, Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo, there's this really cool exchange that the characters have whenever they depart, where they say, no mourners, no funerals. And I really, really wanted something like that. Obviously, I wasn't just gonna steal that, but I really wanted something like it to kind of, like, establish a bond between Nathan and Eddie, and also establish that, like, the two of them are aware on some level that when they depart, they may not see each other again, because where they live is very dangerous. So I wanted to kind of capture that, and I couldn't think of anything, and I brought it up to my fiance, who, for all of these projects I've mentioned, has always been one of my beta readers and always been one of my editors. I love her very dearly, and I brought it up to her, and she said, what about, like, don't tip the ferryman? Because the ferryman of the River Styx, Charon, there's a saying that, you know, if you want to cross the River Styx, you need to give him gold coins. That's why a lot of ancient Greeks buried their dead with either coins over their eyes, sometimes on their tongue, typically on their eyes, I believe. And, you know, as you know, the years and the decades and the centuries went on, and this, like, kind of fear around death and the Grim Reaper, quote-unquote, came around, the saying, don't tip the ferryman, became a thing. So it was basically a way for Nathan and Eddie to say to each other, don't die while I'm gone, okay? And I thought that was really cool, but I was still kind of stuck in, like, the sci-fi shit at this point, and it was around this point where I was like, what do I really, really want to make? A paranormal mystery? Okay. What was I going to call it? Tip the Ferryman. So this webcomic's title exists because of my fiance, and I leaned so hard into this, like, Greek mythology kind of imagery. Nathan is specifically designed to kind of have this resemblance to Charon. Like, he has the lantern, his trench coat kind of makes him look like he has, like, a Grim Reaper's cowl over his back, that sort of thing, right? And there's a couple of other things, but those are massive spoilers for Tip the Ferryman, so I won't say it. Joey was also no longer the protagonist, but I still wanted him to be around, so I designated him to be a little bit younger, just to kind of start exploring this idea of a young child who has lost a parent. By this point, Nathan's twin brother had been renamed to Wilbur, and didn't really know much about that parent because, you know, he was very young whenever Wilbur passed away. So I wanted to start exploring that. So I made Joey a little bit younger. I made him like a side character. He still has a very important arc, of course. He's probably one of the most important characters in the story. And Eddie was something I went back and forth on for a little while, and this was around the time that I was really getting into graffiti art, specifically the works of Keith Haring. So I was starting to research, like, Keith Haring's different pieces and, like, his art style and that sort of thing. I love, like, the funky shapes that he does, and if you can't tell by my voice, I am also a member of, you know, the queer community, so I was delving pretty heavily into his work for that reason. And I got the idea of Eddie being, like, an elusive graffiti artist, and instead of him and Nathan, like, recognizing each other and all that stuff right off the bat, Eddie and Nathan would meet later on in the story, and Eddie would get himself involved in the mystery somehow, right? And I don't actually remember how I landed on the idea of ghosts being kidnapped and going missing. Initially, I think it was going to be a series of possessions and that sort of thing, right? But it just didn't feel like what I wanted it to go for, and I didn't really know what else to do, and I kind of liked this idea of a detective having to solve a disappearance, but it's the disappearance of somebody that's already dead, and it's not the body that's missing, it's the spirit. So I started tossing around what that would look like, and meanwhile, I was also developing other characters, like Eli, for instance. Eli Brusk is the CEO of a thing called SpecTech. I'll get into what a spec is here in a second, but he's a CEO, he's, you know, kind of showy, he's kind of all over the place, and if you're noticing that his name rhymes with something, Yeah, that was intentional. This was around like 2022-ish, where that specific figure was starting to get a lot of ire in the public eye, and me being like someone that was trying to figure shit out for me a little bit. I was very enraged about a lot of like current goings on, and I basically wanted to create a character that is just a gigantic piss take on CEOs, so that's kind of why Eli exists. So I was fleshing him out a little bit more. I was fleshing Joey out a little bit more. I was figuring out what the world building looked like. This was actually probably before 2021, actually, because that's when the comic came out. Like, this all happened over the span of like... Oh, wait, no. Tip the Ferryman didn't come out in 2021. It came out in 2022. I started this comic video with a factual error. So yeah, it probably was 2021. 2021, I'm doing all this development. Most of this happened in the background of most of my other, like, fandom projects and that sort of thing from 2020 to 2021. Makoto was still a character in Tip the Ferryman at the initial pass. Like, in this old illustration of the cover, you can still see them there, but they didn't really fit into the narrative anymore, because they and Joey were kind of the same character, so they were removed from this project and put inside of a different one, which is a project that I've passed off to my fiance because I'm no longer interested in working on it, but she really liked the idea and we were collaborating on it. So Moss is still technically my character, but I've kind of like passed them along to Celine to do stuff with, right? And this was around the time where I started figuring out Mai as a character, and I am not joking, Mai is the most important character in Tip the Ferryman. She is a former fan of Nathan's. Nathan is a very famous paranormal investigator because he essentially ran a Twitch stream where he would educate people about spirits and about how really they're actually not all that dangerous. He'd go out and like meet some of the spirits, show people like, hey, these are just people at the end of the day. They've just got unfinished business. And he dragged Wilbur along with him. It would be like a whole thing. And Mai is a former fan of his that was then inspired to start ghost hunting and stuff soon after the disappearance of her older sister, Eileen. And this is kind of when, like, all the things for Tip the Ferryman really started tying together, right? Like, we've got Mai, who has an older sister. She's a gigantic fan of Nathan's, and Eileen has gone missing. Nathan and Wilbur work together to try to solve Eileen's case, but then the fire that killed Wilbur happened, and Nathan his mental health went down the toilet, so he just stopped working on the case. There's a bit more nuance to that, but I don't want to spoil anything for you guys if you haven't read it already. Again, you can read it at tiptheferryman.com. So all of this stuff was tying together. There was something I was doing with Eddie in the background and Joey and Eli in the background that I can't talk about right now because it's spoilers. And not even it's already in the comic, so, like, just go read it kind of way, and, it's not gonna be in the comic for, like, maybe about 5 to 8 more years, depending, and I started developing, like, all these ideas with the characters, and this is also around the time where the idea of specs came around. So, like I mentioned earlier, Epithet Erased by Jello Apocalypse and his crew is a gigantic inspiration of mine. Epithet Erased is how I've met, like, a lot of my very, very close friends, and it is a series that means a lot to me. And there's a very cool world building thing in that where every character, well, not every character, but like some characters have this thing called an epithet, which is basically like a word imbued on a character's soul that allows them to have some sort of special ability. Like the main character, Molly Blinddeaf, her epithet is dumb, which lets her dumb things down, right? And I liked the idea of epithets, but I like the idea of how they would probably impact a character's identity. Because we see a lot of people, like, dressing in ways that you would expect for them to with their associated spec. For instance, there's Sylvie, who has, I'm forgetting his exact epithet, but he has, like, a sleep-related one. Drowsy, it's Drowsy. And so, like, his outfit's very fluffy, it's very dreamy, he's a psychiatrist, it's pretty cool. So, I was thinking about like what it would mean if, instead of just kind of being randomized, what would happen if an epithet was reflective of somebody's personality, right? So specs came about as these things that are like a power that you basically get from being yourself. Everybody has one. There's not much of like a discrimination issue like there is in Epithet Erased. And it's just basically a reflection of like what your core personality trait is, right? Like Nathan, for instance, he's very good at connecting with people and he's very good at understanding people. So his spec is Spirit, which allows him to see and speak to ghosts, who are people that often go overlooked and unseen. So that's kind of how the theme of identity and like what does identity mean after you die, what is who are you really mean, like what makes you you, and that all kind of like snowballed into all this like exploration of identity and the themes of the like in the themes of the comic, and like what does it mean to be robbed of identity, what does your identity become after you die, are you your legacy or are you just a person, who gets to decide what your legacy is, and just really exploring all of those ideas and all of those themes and that sort of thing. And Mai and Eileen especially were very, very integral to bringing those things about. I don't know how much I can really get into this, but there's kind of a bait and switch that I've pulled with Tip the Ferryman regarding Mai and Nathan specifically that I won't reveal right now because I'm very proud of it and I think it's funny. But let me just say this, whenever it comes to this being like a detective fiction story, Nathan is not Sherlock. He is absolutely not the Sherlock of this duo. He is Watson, and Mai is Sherlock Holmes. I don't know how Eddie fits into that necessarily. Eddie is not just like some guy. He very much has a purpose. I just can't get into it because he is like a very intentionally mysterious character. And he's a graffiti artist that just doesn't, we don't really know much about him. His artist name is literally Who Am I? So, you know. So, the shortest possible version that I could give you of how my comic came about was I made a lot of fan fiction about Half-Life parody series whenever I graduated high school, because we were in the middle of a worldwide crisis and I couldn't go outside. And that's what happens when you don't touch grass. And following that, I started getting other inspirations, like Epithet Erased I was into before Override, but still. And started getting other inspirations. I realized that like the characters I was writing about weren't necessarily the characters I was saying they were in my fix. Like I'd essentially just made my own characters and was slapping other character name and faces onto them to be like, yeah, no, I like still want my audience's attention. And whenever I was able to like separate from that, like don't get me wrong, like wanting the attention of an audience, I should say, is still something I do very, very much struggle with. Webcomics are very long projects and take a really, really long time to complete. And as a result of this, it can be like pretty painful for a lot of people to not receive like a lot of recognition and attention from their like work. And it is something that I do struggle with, but I am trying to be a little bit more of an analog girly, gender neutral, and that has kind of resulted in me having a lot more of a healthy relationship with my art and with my audience and with like creating my webcomic. My webcomic's actually on a pretty large hiatus at the moment because, well, I'm going through a lot at the moment. For those of you that weren't following my social medias, 2025 was a monkey paw ass year for me. It was horrible. And I'm actually in college right now, so I just have a lot on my plate, and I am currently going back and recoloring a lot of Tip the Ferryman's old pages. I think that if you are making a webcomic, do not go back and redraw your pages, right? Like, going back and, like, fixing, like, small things is fine. And I know that coloring is a gigantic thing to fix, but it is literally impossible to read some of the early Tip the Ferryman pages because of how dark the shading and coloring is. Like, there are characters that blend into the background. It's really, really bad. And so I've put the comic on hiatus until I can finish that project. And now there's like a schedule coming out where like entire chapters drop once they're done because I need to accommodate for my needs. And I don't think I would have been able to do that if I hadn't separated from like this idea that I really, really, really need to have this audience's attention, especially from a fandom that I'm not associated with anymore, that I still love, like, a lot, of course, but, like, I don't think about it as much anymore, with exception of Free Mind, because I'm cursed, and I've moved on, and I think that's okay. Like, it's a very natural thing for artists and people in general to go through phases where they make certain things and don't make other things, and that's just kind of how we work as people, and having separated from that is what's really led to me being able to, like, keep my webcomic up the way that I do nowadays, and being willing to kind of break away from that and explore the ideas that I like. Not the ideas that I think are going to hold people around, but the ideas that I find interesting, like paranormal stuff and mysteries and character archetypes like that of Nathan, who's kind of a grumpy dude, but deep down is actually really nice and really fun. He's just going through some stuff, and things like that, right? And the topic of identity, one of my really big special interests is, like, anthropology, like, culture and people and all that sort of thing fascinate me. So what is our cultural idea of identity, and how does, like, the people around us affect identity, I think is a very interesting idea to explore. And that willingness to be able to self-indulge, I think, has been part of the reason why I've been able to keep this project up for such a long time. And yeah, really, that's it. That's the whole story of my webcomic. He would not fucking say that, id, too close to the sun, and now I'm here. And I think that's really about all that I have to say. Like I said, these videos tend to be a little bit shorter. It looks like this one's going to be a bit longer, which is fine by me. But they're unscripted, rambly little projects for me to do while I'm working on bigger projects. There is a gigantic video essay that I've been working on since last year, but I've had to scrap it since then because the finale of the series I was talking about came out just before the end of the year, and so I've had to scrap it and do a lot of work, and there's like just a lot that I'm doing for this one. And I think that's okay. It's like significantly improved the quality of the video because of that, but it's still gonna be a while, so I thought I'd make another one of these to tide you guys off. I also want to give a shout out to my supporters on Ko-Fi, Coffee, whatever you want to call it. You've probably noticed that my microphone quality is a lot better, and that's because of my Ko-Fi supporters. One person in particular, I believe they donated anonymously, so I don't think they'll be okay with me saying their name, but I started a goal on my Ko-Fi to get my mic replaced because it was literally falling apart, and somebody donated twice of what I was going for, and now I have a much better microphone. So if you are watching this, person, thank you very much. It does mean a lot to me, genuinely. If you want to support me, you can actually follow me on my Ko-Fi as well. I have a membership program, and you can get shoutouts at the end of the videos. You get to have previews of upcoming projects. There's works in progresses. There's scrap projects. There's commission discounts. There's all kinds of, like, all this crazy stuff. And you can follow that at Ko-Fi/JPinesArt. And yeah, that's it. If you enjoyed this, check out more of my stuff, in particular 5 tips for starting your webcomic now. I have another video essay coming out by the end of March soon, hopefully. And if you want a hint for what it's about, well, maybe ask your friends in low places. Yeah, that's it. You guys have a wonderful day, and thank you for watching. Please remember to like, comment, subscribe. Goodbye.